Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you, and a very big hug. I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and that life is treating you kind, and that you're getting yourself a lovely hot cup of cocoa with something very warm to drink to keep you nice and comfortable and cosy, as of course the weather starts to get colder where you are, and if you live in a hotter part of the world, go and get yourself something refreshing and cooling to drink. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with it, shall we? And you're going to enjoy this story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, Marcus Devaney returned home to the 10-story apartment block where he lived, called St. James, in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The pockets in his rather bedraggled tartan pants were now completely empty. There wasn't a penny in sight, and his heart was equally as heavy, because life had not been remotely easy here in the Big Apple. His mother back in Tennessee, bless her heart, had assured him that coming to New York City would change his fortune for good. "Go to New York, Marcus," she had said. "Doors will open for you that you never dreamed remotely possible. New York is a vibrant, bustling metropolis where opportunity can grab you by the hand and lead you down an opulent, very auspicious path of good fortune and prosperity. Don't you dare stay here in Tennessee with me looking after your old mother. A young man like yourself needs to be in a bright, exciting place. You've got a whole future ahead of you, love. New York is exactly where you need to be, especially after the war, when everything is coming back to life again, rather like the spring after a very barren winter." Marcus would see his mother about once every 2 months, and that was if he was lucky. He had never really let her know how he barely managed to make ends meet in his current rather bleak circumstances. Things had actually been rather tough for him in New York, but giving his mother such unsettling revelations would have almost certainly broken her heart. April Devaney was a petite, bird-like woman of Irish descent, who had fallen pregnant with Marcus when she was 15 years old, when she had been a very naive Irish lass living in Galway of all places, and to save her family from much embarrassment, shame and humiliation, had subsequently emigrated to America to start a brand new life for herself, by moving in with her father's brother, so that her family back in Ireland would not be shamed about her giving birth out of wedlock. Marcus would never know who his father was, because his mother had enjoyed a fling with a young man from Dublin, whom she never ever saw again. Alas for someone like Marcus, who didn't have a college degree behind him, or any kind of qualification, so to speak, had come to the Big Apple to improve his lot in life, like so many young aspiring hopefuls much like himself, but it had not been without its fraught challenges and drawbacks, of which there had been far too many to count. Put simply, things had been much harder than he had anticipated, and finding work was never easy. It was a laborious struggle. The year was 1948, and Marcus was 25 years old at the time. This was a transitional time for America after the Second World War, a couple of years before the economic boom of the 1950s under Dwight Eisenhower. Marcus was well built as a young man, and he had such a good and kind heart. But that had not got him terribly far in such a competitive marketplace where people were competing for the same very basic jobs, for minimum wage or even less. Marcus had cleaned public toilets, swept the sidewalks, helped in a laundrette, and been a washer-up at a couple of restaurants where he'd worked into the early hours of the morning, ensuring the kitchens were fastidiously clean, so much so that you could actually eat your dinner off the floor. Put simply, he had done all the punishing, back-breaking and dog's-body jobs that nobody else wanted to do. So he was used to getting his hands filthy dirty and being paid pittance for the trouble. His hands had been left with rough skin, and there were unsightly calluses on his fingers. Marcus had rented a dingy apartment from a somewhat formidable landlord called Leonard Delamere, who drove around in a fancy jet-black Rolls-Royce that was so incredibly stunning, people would stop on the sidewalks to stare at the magnificent car, for it was an enviable sight to behold. Leonard de la Mare was profoundly stout. He looked like a cartoon-like character that had stepped out of an 1800s black-and-white movie. He was very old-fashioned and wore a pocket watch on a rather debonair-looking chain, a top hat, come rain or shine, and a very distinguished overcoat. He had curly brown hair, unkempt, rather bushy eyebrows, long sideburns that were slightly gingery on either side of his cheeks, and he wore round glasses that made him look exactly like an owl. So every time the man came to collect his rent money from Marcus, it was difficult not to smile at him and to suppress a laugh. Unfortunately for Marcus, Leonard de la Mare had about as much humour as a stone-cold stodgy bowl of porridge, and always seemed to be disdainful and rather brusque in manner. He looked on Marcus with as much disapproval as you might look on a cockroach on the landing that you'd like to crush under the weight of a heavy boot. He was stinking rich, but did nothing to improve the sad, poor quality living conditions in the tacky apartment block at St. James. The crude, heavily stained carpets on the stairwell were so threadbare that it was easy to get your foot entangled in some of the loose threads, and many people had nearly fallen from such unfortunate confrontations with the deadly, somewhat tawdry carpet. The shabby, very unglamorous hallway was both dingy and dark, with a chandelier that was missing most of its globes, that had never been replaced. There was an overpowering, musty, mildewy smell that suggested there was rising damp somewhere in the building. There were telltale rats' droppings on the landing that suggested the place was infested with rodents. Marcus wasn't remotely surprised by any of this, as one of the elderly residents, a man called Warwick Thomas, who lived on the 6th floor at apartment number 62, would always leave his rubbish in a big brown box outside his front door, with the good intention of throwing it down the rubbish chute. But the old man's waning memory meant, despite his very best intentions, he clean forgot about the most basic of chores, so that the local residents in the apartment block took it upon themselves to dispose of the man's rubbish on his behalf. There was no doubt that this elderly gentleman might have actively encouraged a family of rats to lay down roots in the apartment block. At night, when Marcus lay under the rough and ready, very shabby sheets of his single bed, with a mattress that was so hard you might as well have slept on the floor, for it offered you no comfort whatsoever, he'd often hear a scratching sound and several scuffles, but luckily the light in his room was so dim, thanks to Leonard de la Mare never replacing the light fittings, that Marcus didn't have to watch the nocturnal life going on around him, which for his peace of mind he'd rather not be privy to actually seeing. On one occasion a pair of tiny cold feet had scurried across his face and given him quite the shock. Sometimes it was best to turn a blind eye to such things, or you might be refused a good night's sleep, and with a kind of hard labour Marcus put in most of his manual jobs that invariably required a lot of elbow grease. He needed to get all the sleep he possibly could. Some of the residents at St. James had put traps around the apartments' hallways and corridors, but alas, the salient rats seemed to be too clever for their own good, and only a pitiful few had ever been successfully caught. One of the residents had brought in a cat called Talissa to go after the rats in the apartment, but alas, Talissa's interest in the rat population was minimal. She had far more interest in defending her own turf from other stray cats that might have ideas above their station, and think that they could move into St. James. That was certainly not going to happen under Talissa's discerning watch. Talissa was engaged in all kinds of brawls with the stray cats in the neighbourhood, especially those who attempted to make St. James their new home. They did so with little success. Talissa's caterwauling could be heard into the late hours of the night, when she was having confrontations with other cats, that she was always determined to chase away, come hell or high water. Talissa seemed to visit all the residents in the apartment block, but had a special attachment to Marcus for reasons Marcus did not understand. But they often say cats choose their owners, not the other way around, even though Talissa did not belong to Marcus. Talissa's owner was rather indifferent towards the cat, especially since Talissa had made no inroads into the rat population. She was always artfully on the prowl for titbits among many of the residents, who were seduced by the cat's affectionate nature, and they would regularly feed her, so that she grew fatter and fatter. But as for catching rats, she had failed in that endeavour. By nature she was naturally lazy, and seemed to enjoy sleeping most of the day, lounging on the people's couches at St. James. But it was usually Marcus that received the regular visits from the cat, and if anyone was looking for Talissa, they'd more than likely find her lying lackadaisically on Marcus's rather scruffy couch. Talissa certainly had a taste for the good life. She seemed to think all the residents that occupied the apartments at St. James belonged to her in some way, so that any other cats daring to venture close to the apartments, well, they'd be held to pay as far as she was concerned. She kept them all at bay, even if it meant she continued to caterwaul during the night. Every time Marcus or any of the local residents living at the apartment block in St. James raised some of their issues with Leonard de la Mare about the ramshackle, decrepit state of the apartment block and the desperate need for the crumbling, unsound building to be fixed up and repaired, especially the electric connections that were seriously dodgy and would probably be considered illegal, Leonard de la Mare would all but give the residents a haughty, rather cocky and smug look and say, "If you don't like it here, you can always move away, can you not? It's no skin off my nose if you leave. Many people want to rent out my apartments at such a steal, so if you don't want your apartment, I can get a replacement in half a second." Alas, there was no arguing with Leonard de la Mare on this bitter truth that reminded the residents of their low rank in society, where their voices of complaint were always lost to the wind. So the residents at the St. James apartment block were stuck between a rock and a hard place. The apartments at St. James were cheap and extremely affordable, if you were down on your luck, that is, and pretty much didn't have a brass farthing to rub together, which might explain why they were in such a decrepit state of decay. But Marcus was resigned to the fact that beggars can't always be choosers, so he accepted his lot without too much complaint. Sometimes you had to settle for less than congenial conditions just to survive, and at the very least he was living better than some people in our society, even though that wasn't saying very much. He shuddered as he thought about his mother back at home, and how she would react if she was to see his current living conditions. Life in Tennessee had been tough, granted that, and people didn't have life easy there, but he'd lived a whole lot better than out here in the Big Apple. And if his mother knew the truth, the sobering truth that is, about his current lot in life, the woman would be absolutely devastated. Marcus had put his mother's mind at rest by assuring her that he had found the perfect apartment and had a great job at a restaurant. He failed to mention his job at the restaurant that he had had at the time was only about washing the dishes in the back scullery, in piping hot soapy water that had made his fingers go raw, rather than showing people to their tables, greeting all the patrons, or managing the staff. Those were details he failed to mention to his mother, to offer her peace of mind, and the soft ball of assurance that all was going well with him, when the reverse was actually true. But Marcus was far too proud to disappoint his beloved mother. Marcus often soothed himself by assuring himself that at the very least, at least here at St. James, he had a roof over his head, even if it did mean the odd rat trotted over his face during the ungodly hours of the night, mistaking him for a railway track. He was grateful for small mercies, however pitiful they may actually be. Marcus's poky little apartment was dingy and small, but it had a tiny kitchen, bathroom, living room area and bedroom, and very often Talissa the cat would pay him a special visit, which she did every day like clockwork, slipping through the kitchen window, which she was beginning to struggle to squeeze through these days, owing to her recent weight gain. She would hang out on the couch with him, especially if the sun cast its warm rays across the sofa, as the cat loved to lap up the sunshine, as if she was a salamander. Talissa, for some reason, loved lying among Marcus's clothes, as if his familiar scent offered her comfort. He enjoyed the cat's company very much, and would regularly find himself talking to Talissa, telling her about his life in Tennessee. Talissa would look at him through her yellow eyes, and Marcus felt in her that he'd found a friend, even if it was the furry variety that couldn't exactly talk back. It was lonely being in New York, where Marcus had made absolutely no friends, as people were caught up in their own little social gatherings. But there was a good atmosphere in New York post-war, and people were genuinely optimistic about the future. As with Hitler's reign of terror coming to an abrupt full stop, people could begin to dream again. When Marcus returned home to the apartment, he opened the scratched-up red front door with the number 82 engraved in the wood, and let out a grievous sigh. He made his way into the poky kitchen, where he knew the food left in the tiny little cupboard above the sink that he referred to as the pantry would be pitiful, and with no money left to his name, he was in a seriously bad place. He could see in the cupboard was a can of sardines, a box of dried-up biscuits, a packet of spaghetti, and a tin of tomatoes. He knew only too well the tin of sardines would likely end up being eaten by Talissa. He could refuse that cat nothing, even if he had to go hungry himself, as such was his devotion to a cat that could well do with losing a few pounds, if the truth be told. Marcus had already paid this week's rent, but he needed to find work to gather the funds for next week's rent, or Leonard Delamere would more than likely throw him out of his apartment, and if he wasn't careful he might end up in a homeless shelter, and that was the last place he'd want to end up. He'd sometimes picked up a bowl of soup at a local soup kitchen, with a big chunk of brown bread, when times were tough for him. But moving into a homeless shelter was falling down a slippery slope, and once you hit the bottom, it was almost impossible to climb back up again. He'd seen it all before, too many times to mention. Homeless people who'd given up all hope, that had been evacuated from their lives. Marcus didn't want to sink to that rock-bottom place if he could possibly help it. He was not going to go down without a fight. This had been a taxing day, if ever he'd seen one, in which he'd been unable to find any local work. He had waited patiently on the corner of Broadway, with a whole lot of like-minded unemployed people, all waiting for an opportunity to find some day work. On this occasion Marcus had not been one of the lucky ones, and favour had failed to shine down upon him. Marcus had walked away with some of the other stragglers, realizing that this was not going to be a good day for him, for any job opportunities had sadly eluded him. With a heavy heart and a resigned spirit, Marcus had walked to the post office to inspect the advertisements for jobs on the notice board there. He'd seen a sign that had not been there the previous day, written on a pink, very fancy stock card in a rather elegant flowing hand. For some reason it had grabbed his undivided attention almost at once. In that fleeting second his heart began to judder in his chest. He looked rather nervously around the post office to see if anyone was paying him attention, but people were very absorbed in their own affairs. One woman was having a go at the woman behind the reception desk at the post office about the cost of postal stamps being way too expensive. Someone else was having their letter weighed to get a price for how much the postal costs would be to send the chunky letter abroad. No one appeared to have noticed Marcus loitering around the notice board, albeit rather furtively. In this quintessential moment Marcus had struck while the iron was hot. He sneakily snatched the advertisement away from the signboard, so that the pin fell to the ground. He clandestinely tucked the pink piece of stock card into his pocket, folding it with a degree of difficulty. No one had seen him do it. Marcus was well used to applying for jobs time after time, when there were several other applicants applying for the same job. He hoped by sneaking away this advertisement he would reduce the odds dramatically. Marcus reasoned that if you ironed away the competition by being the only job applicant applying for the job, it certainly increased your likelihood of being employed, and Marcus was absolutely desperate to find work. He couldn't go on living hand to mouth like this. He needed some form of steady, reliable income. At some point he wanted to return to Tennessee with money for his mother, so she could purchase some nice things for herself. As slowly but surely the economy was beginning to improve, Marcus knew that in this dog-eat-dog world you sometimes did what you needed to do to survive, as America was still struggling to get back on her feet again after the war. For some reason the advertisement had grabbed his attention, especially the handsome wage being offered. When he returned to his apartment and put on the kettle to make some much-needed tea, his calloused fingers trembled very excitedly as he pulled the crumpled piece of stock card out of his pocket to study and examine it more clearly. He felt a thrilling tingle trickle down his spine. the likes of such he'd never experienced before. He read the ad. For some reason he knew this sounded like the perfect job for him, offering not only an irresistibly decent wage package, but also a guaranteed roof over his head. Given most of Marcus's money was spent on paying his weekly rent to Lena della Mare, not having to pay rent would be a godsend for him. As a consequence, maybe he really would be able to save up some good money to bring home to Tennessee for his mother, and that would make her very proud. He could see in his mind's eye her little face breaking out into a huge smile as he presented her with a sizable amount of cash. She would say very demurely, "But I can't possibly accept all this money from you, Marcus. It's far too much, far too generous of you." Marcus would smile at his mother and say, "There's plenty more where that came from, ma'am. Just enjoy, will you?" As Marcus thought about this, he was more resolutely determined than ever to find the job that could change his life for the better. Marcus read the advertisement over and over again, trying to get the full measure of what this job was about. The ad read, "Groundskeeper needed for Clayton Manor in New York State, an hour and a half outside of New York. Private rural address will be given on application in response to the advertisement. You will receive a handsome weekly wage packet and live on the property grounds. Job includes sweeping up dead leaves, weeding, manicuring the lawns, hedges, and taking care of the soon-to-be-established rose gardens. Contact Mr. Zach O'Rourke at 554-3456. No experience needed, but you must be hard-working and dedicated and reasonably strong. Job will not be for the faint of heart." "I must get to the phone," thought Marcus, fumbling around the apartment to look for change. But he had no money at his disposal, until of course he remembered he had a couple of coins at the bottom of his old suitcase, which was at the top of the old run-down closet, covered with dust, that he'd clean forgotten all about. He had left the coins there at the bottom of the suitcase for a rainy day, if things became bleak enough, and he needed the money. Marcus brought down the old suitcase. It crashed to the ground with a mighty bang, shaking the entire apartment, and rattling all the furnishings, bringing down with it a long sheet of dust that made Marcus wheeze, cough, and splutter. "Bloody hell," he thought, "I can barely breathe in here." He had no idea there was so much dust on top of that closet. Marcus emptied the decrepit old suitcase, which was an ancient relic from the First World War, that had belonged to a family member of theirs that had long since passed away. For a moment he stared disbelievingly at the wooden floor, as the coins he believed were in the suitcase did not appear to be there, and for a moment all the valuable life-giving breath was rudely sucked out of his lungs with the force of an industrial vacuum cleaner, as he pondered on what to do. How could he apply for a job if he had no money for a payphone? Maybe he could borrow some loose change from the nice lady living in the apartment next door to his, but he didn't want to rely on the kindness of strangers. He frantically began to shake the suitcase, tipping it upside down. He was behaving like a desperate rat, looking for a life-giving morsel or crumb of cheese, and then he heard a tinkling sound and something clunked to the floor, and then he found the coins he was looking for. He was so relieved. He felt like a drowning man who suddenly found a life vest and knows that he's not going to drown after all. With dirty, filthy hands covered with a tsunami of dust that greeted him from the closet, covering his hair and face, making Marcus look as if he swept chimneys for a living, he hastily pocketed the coins, looking down on them as a pirate's ill-gotten treasure. He scrambled out of his apartment like an eager raccoon that had received the bounty from a bakery dumpster and had rushed off with a couple of dry doughnuts as trophies. He'd almost locked himself out of the front door in the process, as such was his eager enthusiasm and haste to get to a phone box in time. But luckily he put his foot in the door before it slammed shut behind him, which was just as well, as he couldn't possibly afford to pay for the services of a locksmith to get him back into the apartment again, as that would be money he could ill afford to spend. And calling the likes of Lena della Mare to come to his help, to give him a spare key, would be a costly mistake he would be unlikely to forget, and would likely cost him the deposit on his apartment. Moments later he trotted down the street, having received some rather disapproving, condescending glances from a couple of well-dressed women, wearing elegant A-line skirts with thin belts and matching bodices, who looked appalled by the state of him, but Marcus didn't care a jot. He hastily dashed all the way to the phone box. He was completely out of breath by the time he reached it. But to his bitter disappointment, a wealthy woman was standing at the phone box, wearing a perfectly meticulous smock dress. Her ear was pinned to the phone. She was having a garrulous, lackadaisical natter with a girlfriend of hers. And Marco wanted to scream blue murder. He was so frustrated, as in his mind's eye, the longer the woman talked, the sooner the job he was after might be given to some other hopeful applicant, as that was the sad story of his life. And for all he knew, Zach O'Rourke, the man who had obviously posted the ad, might have placed similar ads around other parts of the city, which was more than likely the case. "Please hurry up, you old bat," he was inwardly praying. "Please get off the damned phone. I need this job before somebody else gets it." The woman at the phone box was obnoxiously loud. Even Marcus, who had not wanted to eavesdrop on her conversation, could not help but hear every single vain word that was spoken. He could not help but feel that the fairer sex had made talking into an art form, as Marcus was a man of few words himself. "Oh, yes, I know. Isn't it frightful? I don't mean to be rude, but that woman dresses like a washerwoman in every sense of the word. She has absolutely no style, does she?" "I know. Yes, I know. Oh, my God, that hair of hers. It's too dreadful for words, frightfully fizzy. I'm so grateful I don't have hair that's so atrociously untamed. Mine is manageable, you know. But then I do use a very good shampoo. I use Peggy Brown's lustrous cream shampoo with conditioners in it. It's my best-kept secret." "Oh, thank you. No, everybody tells me that my hair is beautiful, so now you know my secret too. Yes, the shampoo's very expensive, but Peggy Brown's shampoo is in a league of its own. And honestly, it can tame down the worst frizz." "Oh, I know. You're absolutely right. I've never liked her either. She's dreadfully haughty. Thinks she's better than anybody else, doesn't she? The other day, I know she saw me because she crossed the road to the other side. She pretended not to see me. Now that is rude. Anyway, she dashed into the Rose Maddox hat shop of all places. She came out with 3 striped boxes of hats. And I'm not kidding you either. You know what Rose Maddox's hats are like. They're as close to perfect as you can get. I mean, we're talking super expensive. Those hats cost a bob or two, let me tell you. That woman knows how to spend her husband's money. That's why she married him in the first place. But she's got no charm whatsoever. I know. I absolutely know. Don't tell me you think she's attractive, Anna. Honestly, how can you say that? Where did you get that absurd idea from? The woman is like Cinderella's ugly sister. She's as ugly as they come. She thinks she's a stunner, of course, but she's not. Well, yes, we can agree to disagree, shall we? But I think she's frightful in every sense of the word, and I'm sorry, but I do." The woman appeared to be having an argument about whether this woman they were nattering about was attractive or not, although they both established she was filthy rich and spoilt rotten, whoever she was. And in that regard Marcus did not care. He wanted this annoying, frustrating woman to get off the phone as soon as she possibly could, as he needed to make that essential phone call that could potentially change his entire life, while this woman's idle gossip served no greater purpose. Finally Marcus sighed with relief when the woman was saying, Hello, are you there, Anna? Are you there? Oh, dear me, I've run out of money, can you believe it? Yes, I've got no more spare change. I'm going to have to end the call, I'm afraid. But don't you worry, we can continue this conversation tomorrow. I know it's a dreadful nuisance, but what can you do? Finally, the woman left the phone booth, mumbling under her breath that there was no way that a woman like Lucy Tucker was remotely attractive. Marcus quickly dived into the phone booth, rather like a vulture onto a dead carcass, as if his entire life depended on it. He pressed the coin into the slot, dialed the number, and inwardly prayed someone would answer the phone. "Please, God, may I get this job?" He realized that he was praying a silent prayer, and he hoped that God would in some way hear him. "Hello," came the answer at the end of the phone. "Zach O'Rourke speaking. How may I help you?" "Hello, Mr. O'Rourke. This is Marcus Deveroy speaking. You don't know me, but I saw your advertisement in the post office, written on the pink stock card, this afternoon, advertising for a groundskeeper for Clayton Manor. I'm interested in the job, sir. I'm hard-working, strong, reliable and trustworthy." There was a long pause at the end of the phone, until finally Zach O'Rourke spoke. "Thank you very much, Mr. Deveroy, for responding to my advertisement. Have you, by any chance, had any experience in taking care of a large property?" "Yes, sir. I've done plenty of yard work before. I'm quite capable of getting my hands dirty, and I'm extremely strong." "Very well, Mr. Deveroy. Since you are the only applicant we've had for the job, in the circumstances for the time being the job is yours, provided, of course, you do a satisfactory job. You will receive your wages weekly, Mr. Deveroy, and live on the property in the little cottage on the grounds that I have had prepared for you. If I'm not fully satisfied with your work, you will be asked to leave forthwith." Zach O'Rourke rattled off the address of Clayton Manor. "You will start work on Thursday, Mr. Deveroy. I look forward to you working for me." And before Marcus could ask him anything else about the job, Zach O'Rourke had put down the telephone and abruptly ended the phone call. So there we are, that's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.